Found out my parents left everything to my sister in their will. Not even a thank you for years of financial help. So I quietly stopped covering their bills. 2 months later, my mom texted me. Send $800 now. The power's about to be cut off. No greeting, no explanation. I, 34M, discovered something that shattered everything I thought I knew about my family while cleaning out my father's desk after his minor stroke last month. For the past 6 years, I've been sending my parents $1,200 every month like clockwork. When Dad's construction business went under during the recession, I stepped up. When Mom's part-time retail job barely covered groceries, I covered the gap. Their mortgage, utilities, car payments, medical bills. I handled it all while building my own software consulting business from nothing. My sister lives 3 states away with her investment banker husband in their suburban mansion. She visits twice a year, posts Instagram photos with Mom and Dad during holidays, and everyone talks about how successful and busy she is. Meanwhile, I'm the son who lives 20 minutes away, shows up for every family dinner, fixes their leaky faucets, and quietly transfers money every month without them ever having to ask twice. Last Tuesday, Dad had his stroke. Nothing major, but enough to land him in the hospital for observation. Mom was frantic, so I rushed over to help organize their paperwork for the insurance claims. She asked me to grab some documents from Dad's home office while she stayed at the hospital. That's when I found they were sitting right there on his desk, probably pulled out for some estate planning discussion with their lawyer. I wasn't snooping. It was literally on top of a stack of medical bills I was supposed to organize. I opened it expecting to see the typical split between children, maybe some specific items designated for each of us. What I found made my hands shake. Everything, the house I'd been helping pay for, their savings account I'd been contributing to, Dad's restored 1967 Mustang that we'd worked on together every weekend for 2 years, even Mom's jewelry collection that she always said would be mine to give to my future wife. All of it was going to my sister. The reasoning was spelled out in black and white. Our daughter has provided emotional support and maintained strong family connections despite geographic distance, while our son has been focused primarily on his career development. Career development. 6 years of financial support reduced to career development. I sat in that office for 20 minutes, reading it over and over, trying to make sense of it. There was no mention of the thousands I'd sent them. No acknowledgement that I'd basically been their financial lifeline while their golden child sent Christmas cards and called on birthdays. I photographed the relevant pages with my phone, put everything back exactly where I found it, and drove home in complete silence. That night, I made a decision. I canceled the automatic transfer I'd set up years ago. No dramatic announcement, no confrontation. I simply stopped sending money. The first month passed quietly. Dad recovered well from his stroke, and everything seemed normal during our weekly family dinners. They asked about work. I asked about Dad's physical therapy. Mom complained about her neighbor's loud dog. Standard family conversation. Month 2 was when reality started setting in for them. I was at my office when Mom's text came through. Send $800 now. The power's about to be cut off. No, hi honey. No, hope you're doing well. Not even an explanation of why they suddenly needed money when they'd been managing fine in their minds. Just a demand for $800 like I was their personal ATM. I stared at that text for a long time. 6 years of helping them. And this is how she talks to me when she needs something. Like hired help. I texted back. What happened to your usual budget? Her response came immediately. Don't give me attitude. We need this money today. I asked her to explain why they suddenly had financial problems, and she told me Dad's disability payments were delayed and they were behind on several bills. She never once mentioned the 6 years I'd been covering these exact same bills without being asked. I told her I couldn't send money right now because I had my own expenses to handle, which was true. I'd been using that $1,200 monthly to pay down my business loans and build up my emergency fund. She called me 30 seconds later. I let it go to voicemail. Her message was brutal. I can't believe you're being so selfish right now. Your father just had a stroke and you're worried about your precious money. We raised you better than this. That word, selfish, hit me like a physical blow. I'd spent 6 years being anything but selfish. 6 years of making sure they could keep their house, keep their cars running, keep their dignity intact while their friends thought they were doing fine financially. 6 years of quiet, Consistent support that let Dad maintain his pride and Mom avoid the embarrassment of asking her wealthy daughter for help. But now I was selfish for not responding immediately to a rude demand for money. I called my sister that evening. We hadn't talked in probably 4 months, but I needed to understand something. I told her about Mom's emergency request and asked if she knew about their financial situation. Her response floored me. She had no idea they were struggling. She thought they were doing great because they never asked her for help and always seemed comfortable during her visits. When I mentioned that I'd been helping them financially, she seemed genuinely surprised. She said she figured Dad's disability and Mom's job were covering everything, and she'd offered to help a few times over the years, but they always said they were fine. I didn't mention the will. Not yet. But her reaction confirmed what I already suspected. Our parents had been protecting her from their financial reality while expecting me to shoulder it silently. The next few days were tense. Mom called twice more demanding money, and both times I explained that I needed more information about their financial situation before I could help. I offered to sit down with them and go through their budget together, figure out a long-term solution instead of just emergency fixes. She refused. She said they didn't need me managing their finances, they just needed the money they were asking for. On Friday, she texted me that they'd borrowed money from their neighbor to keep the power on, and that I should be ashamed of myself for letting it get that far. That weekend, Dad called me. His approach was different, more guilt than anger. He told me he was disappointed in how I was handling things, that family was supposed to help family without conditions or questions. He said he'd raised me to be better than this, and he couldn't understand why I was suddenly acting like a stranger. I asked him directly, "Dad, how much money do you think I've sent you over the past 6 years?" Long pause. He said he knew I'd helped out sometimes, but he didn't keep track of exact amounts. He said what mattered was that family supported each other, not the dollar amounts. I told him it was over $70,000. $70,000 I'd sent them without being asked, without conditions, without making them feel small or guilty about needing help. Another long pause. He said he appreciated everything I'd done, but that didn't change the fact that they needed help now and I was the only one who could provide it. I asked him why he'd never asked my sister for help. He said she had her own life and her own expenses, and they didn't want to burden her when they knew I was doing well with my business. That's when it clicked completely. I was successful enough to help, but not successful enough to deserve protection from being asked. My sister was successful enough to deserve protection from being asked, but somehow not successful enough to help. I was the convenient son, close enough to be available, successful enough to be useful, but not valued enough to be considered in their future plans. I told Dad I needed some time to think about everything, and I'd call him back. Instead, I spent the weekend researching elder care resources, financial assistance programs, and budgeting tools. If they wanted help, I'd help them find sustainable solutions instead of just throwing money at problems every month. Monday morning, I sent them both a text with links to senior financial assistance programs, contact information for a financial counselor who specialized in fixed income budgeting, and an offer to drive them to appointments if they wanted to explore these options. Mom's response: "We don't need charity. We need our son to help his family." That afternoon, my sister called me. Mom had reached out to her explaining that I was being difficult about helping with their bills. My sister was confused because she still didn't understand the scope of what I'd been doing for years. I told her everything. The monthly payments, the 6 years of financial support, the way they'd shielded her from their money problems while expecting me to handle them quietly. I told her about finding the will, about being written off as career-focused when I'd actually been family-focused to my own financial detriment. She was quiet for a long time after I finished. Finally, she said she had no idea it had been going on, and she felt terrible that they'd put that entire burden on me. She offered to start sending them money herself, or we could split their expenses going forward. I appreciated the offer, but I told her that wasn't the point anymore. The point was that they'd made decisions about all of our roles in this family without consulting any of us. They decided I was the financial backup plan while she got to be the beloved daughter who was too important to bother with their problems. 2 weeks later, Dad had what I think was meant to be a heart-to-heart conversation with me. He asked me to come over on a Saturday morning to help him organize his workshop, which was usually code for, "We need to talk about something serious." While we were sorting through his tools, he brought up the money situation. He said he and Mom had been talking, and they realized they'd been taking my help for granted. He said they appreciated everything I'd done, and they didn't want money issues to damage our relationship. I asked him if he'd be willing to sit down together and create an actual budget, figure out what they truly needed versus what they were spending money on unnecessarily. I suggested we could work out a plan where both my sister and I contributed, but with clear expectations and limits instead of just emergency requests. He agreed, which surprised me. We spent that afternoon going through their actual expenses, and I realized they'd been living beyond their means in small ways that added up. Eating out twice a week, premium cable packages, magazine subscriptions they never read, a gym membership Mom hadn't used in 2 years. We identified about $400 in monthly savings they could make through simple changes. Combined with Dad's disability and Mom's part-time income, they actually could cover their basic expenses without help. The extra money they'd been asking for was maintaining a lifestyle they couldn't afford anymore. I offered to help them for 3 more months while they adjusted their spending, with clear communication about when that help would end. I also told them I expected my sister to contribute equally if they needed ongoing support beyond that. Dad seemed relieved to have a concrete plan instead of just ongoing uncertainty. But Mom's reaction when he explained our conversation to her was different. She said she didn't understand why everything had to be so complicated and why I couldn't just help them like I always had without turning it into a business negotiation. That's when I decided to address the will directly. I asked them both to sit down with me the following weekend. I brought printed copies of the sections I'd photographed, and I put them on their kitchen table without saying a word. The silence that followed was deafening. Finally, Mom said I had no right to go through their private papers. I pointed out that she'd asked me to organize their paperwork, and that their estate planning wasn't the issue anyway. The issue was the reasoning behind their decisions. I read the line about me being focused primarily on career development, while my sister provided emotional support and maintained strong family connections. I asked them how they reconciled that statement with 6 years of financial support, weekly family dinners, being their go-to person for every emergency, and handling every repair and maintenance issue on their house. Dad looked genuinely uncomfortable. Mom looked angry. She said the will was about more than just money, and that my sister had always been better at staying emotionally connected to the family despite the distance. I asked her to define emotional connection. Was it the monthly phone calls my sister made, which lasted about 10 minutes and covered surface-level topics? Was it the twice-yearly visits where she stayed for 3 days and spent most of that time taking photos for social media? Or was emotional connection showing up at the hospital within an hour of Dad's stroke, handling their insurance paperwork, making sure their bills were paid so they could focus on recovery, and checking on them every week for 6 years? Mom said I was being unfair to my sister, and that just because I'd helped financially didn't mean I got to dictate their estate planning. She was right about that. Their money, their choice. But I told them they also didn't get to dictate my financial planning. And going forward, my financial planning wouldn't include monthly transfers to people who saw me as a convenient resource rather than a valued family member. The conversation ended badly. Mom said I was being vindictive and manipulative, using money as a weapon to get my way. Dad said very little, but he looked like he was starting to understand the bigger picture. I left that day knowing our relationship had fundamentally changed. Over the next month, things were awkward but manageable. They adjusted their spending, Dad's disability payments got back on track, and they didn't ask me for money. We still had family dinners, but the conversation was more strained. My sister came to visit for Mom's birthday 6 weeks later. I wasn't sure what Mom had told her about our conversation, but she pulled me aside on the second day of her visit. She said Mom had explained that I was upset about their will, and she wanted to understand my perspective better. I walked her through everything again, but this time I focused on the pattern of how they'd managed our relationships with them, how they'd consistently protected her from having to deal with their problems while expecting me to handle them silently, how they'd created a dynamic where she got to be the successful, distant daughter they were proud of, while I became the reliable, local son they counted on. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she said something that surprised me. She said she'd always felt guilty about not helping more, but every time she'd offered, they'd insisted they were fine and didn't need anything from her. She said she'd assumed they were just being polite, but she'd started to wonder if they were actually protecting her from something. She told me that during this visit, she'd noticed things were different. They seemed more stressed about money. Mom had mentioned several times how expensive everything was getting, and Dad had made comments about having to be more careful with spending. She asked if she could contribute to their monthly expenses going forward, not as a temporary emergency measure, but as an ongoing responsibility that we'd share equally. I told her I'd stopped sending them money entirely, and I explained my reasoning. I said if she wanted to help them, that was her choice, but I was done being their unacknowledged financial safety net. She said she understood, and she respected my decision. That evening, she had a conversation with our parents that I wasn't part of, but Dad filled me in later. She'd told them she wanted to start sending them $600 every month, and she wanted to understand their actual budget so she could help appropriately. She'd also told them she felt bad that I'd been carrying their financial burden alone for so long, and she thought they should have asked both of us for help instead of relying on just one of us. According to Dad, Mom had gotten defensive and said they'd never asked me for help. I'd just started sending money on my own. My sister had pointed out that whether they'd asked directly or not, they'd been accepting the money for 6 years and clearly counting on it, since they were in crisis mode the moment it stopped. After she left, Dad called me and asked if we could talk again. This time, he was more direct than I'd ever heard him be. He said he and Mom had been discussing everything that had happened over the past few months, and he was starting to realize they'd made some mistakes in how they'd handled things with both their children. He said they'd gotten comfortable with my help and had stopped seeing it as help. They'd started seeing it as just how things were. He admitted they'd made assumptions about what I could afford and what I was willing to do without really checking with me. He also said he was beginning to understand why the will had hurt me so deeply. He said when they'd written it, they'd been thinking about which child had stayed more connected emotionally over the years, but they hadn't considered that different people show connection in different ways. I asked him what he wanted to do about it. He said he thought they should revise the will to be more equitable, but he wanted to discuss it with Mom first. He also said he wanted to make sure both my sister and I were comfortable with whatever financial arrangement we worked out going forward, instead of just expecting one of us to handle everything. I told him I appreciated his honesty, and I was glad we were finally talking about all of this directly instead of just letting assumptions and expectations build up over time. But I also told him that the money wasn't really the core issue anymore. The core issue was trust and respect and feeling valued as a family member rather than just as a resource. I said I needed to see changes in how they approached their relationship with me. Not just financial changes, but changes in how they communicated, how they made decisions that affected me, and how they acknowledged my contributions to the family. He said he understood, and he thought that was fair. Update 1. 3 months later, things have stabilized into a new normal that feels healthier for everyone. My parents revised their will to split everything equally between my sister and me. They also made the effort to acknowledge, both privately and to other family members, that I'd been supporting them financially for years. Mom even thanked me directly for my help, which was the first time she'd done that in all the years I'd been sending money. My sister and I now alternate months sending them $400 each, which covers the gap in their budget after they made the spending adjustments we discussed. They send us both a monthly text with a brief update on their finances, so we know how the money is being used and can adjust if their needs change. More importantly, they've started asking both of us for input on major decisions instead of just expecting me to handle problems after the fact. When their car needed major repairs last month, they called both of us to discuss whether they should fix it or start looking for a replacement. I still show up for weekly dinners and help with household projects, but now it feels like a choice rather than an obligation. And when my sister visits, she makes more effort to handle some of the practical stuff instead of just socializing. The biggest change is in how we communicate about family responsibilities. Instead of operating on assumptions about what each person should or can contribute, we actually discuss things directly. It's not perfect, and there are still moments when old patterns try to resurface. But for the first time in years, I feel like I'm seen as a complete family member rather than just the convenient son who lives nearby. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for your family is stop enabling them to take you for granted.